Hi students of the Perusable Feast, coming to you with wet hair, sorry about that, but I was too excited to make this video, I didn't want to wait, because this week is syntax, which I love syntax, as you already have heard from my previous videos. First of all, I want to say thank you so much for your flexibility last week when I was dealing with a family situation. Very kind of you, received a lot of kind responses, and yeah, I'll be getting back to all of you in the next 24 to 48 hours and catching up on grading. This week is pretty much free for me. So yeah, I'll just be focusing on this class. Right, so that being said, because I had some inability to work last week, if you turned in assignments late, or weren't able to get an assignment in because you were unsure about a specific thing. I know the Pantone week can often be stressful because it's such a collaborative process. Yeah, don't worry about it. If it's in now, I'll grade it. If it's not there, I'll shoot you an email and let you know that I haven't received it yet and there's not going to be a penalty. I really don't do penalties for late work in this class anyway. As long as everything is in by the end, you're good to go. Yeah, so let's talk about syntax. Syntax is, whether you know it or not, present in every utterance. It's, when we think about units of speech, syntax is sort of the way to graph, to make a machine of the way we talk. So it could be as simple as grammar, sentence structure, things like commas, things like em dashes, things like periods, things like exclamation points, all of these punctuative kind of tools we use to create sentence structure, which is syntax. But sentence structure is only part of it, right? Syntax extends beyond the unit of the sentence, both smaller and larger. A phrasal unit, a phrase, contains syntax. The placement of that phrase within the sentence is a syntactical gesture. And then larger, even larger than that, the unit of the paragraph, or in a poem, the unit of the stanza. The movement of a piece as a whole contains syntactical elements. Yeah, and so it's a force like any other force in writing that we can sort of tinker with and manipulate in order to achieve effect. Often we think in terms of writing with clarity to have a sort of standard unit of the sentence. Subject, verb, object, direct object, indirect object, all those things. Starting with the subject first and then moving on towards what the subject does and what it does that thing to. Very clear sentence, the sort of primary mechanism of speech. However, if all of our sentences appear in that particular format, a reader might grow bored or restless or unsure of the sort of undercurrent of feeling or importance beneath that sort of unit of speaking or writing. And so we have to vary that. Even in your classes in school, likely, your teachers are telling you have to vary the ways in which you write in terms of structure, sentence structure, syntax. I'm gonna say those words over and over again. And so in creative writing, it's exactly the same. It's all about maintaining both reader intrigue, interest, the sonic components, the sound, the cadence, the meter in the poem, or there's meter in all of our speech. And so thinking about the way sentences, phrases, paragraphs move, flow, and how we can sort of manipulate that through our structured units of phrase and sentence and paragraph. How might we do this and why might we do this? A way in which syntactical manipulation is done is to think about what famous poet Jory Graham calls the movement of the mind. The sound must echo the sense is actually what she says. We want our sentences to reflect their content. The structure of the sentence or the paragraph should reflect the content of that unit. And so, like I said in an earlier video, let's say you're talking about a very pragmatic, you're talking through the lens of a pragmatic speaker. perhaps the sentence units are logical, clear, like that sort of primary sentence structure, subject, verb, object that or that I talked about a moment ago. Clear, logical units of sentence, not too long, not too short, maybe a little curt if they're super pragmatic, or perhaps a pragmatic person who's frustrated. The sort of like the essential, efficient logic of that sentence reflects the mentality of its speaker. Perhaps you have a anxious speaker, someone who's in an anxiety-inducing predicament. How does that anxiety transpose, if you're into music, in that mind? Do they have fragmented thoughts? Do they trail off? Are they, if so, I guess we could say, if they're trailing off, perhaps a lot of ellipses, perhaps phrases rather than sentences. Perhaps there's not a logical component, and things become associative and fragmented, and your sentences can reflect that state of mind. Perhaps if it's an anxious speaker, they have sort of a spontaneous overflow, right? An overflow of thoughts that doesn't contain punctuation. Perhaps it's sort of like like a spontaneous overflow of long sentences that we might call run-on sentences, but in creative writing, we have a little bit of license to do that, to not adhere to standard grammar, because at the end of the day, it's art, and so we don't have to follow the rules as long as we know them. And so those are sort of syntactical gestures you can do to create emotional stakes. Clarity for a reader, even when it might seem like a run-on sentence isn't the clearest thing, it actually is engaging in a level of clarity beyond that sort of like communicable sense, because it's giving them a deeper understanding and picture of the essence of that character in that moment. And so the readings for this week deal with syntax excellently. As a poet myself, I have many examples of writers who do syntax in interesting ways. We might think back to the old romantic, capital R romantic poet John Keats, in his poem Ode to a Nightingale. You might have read it in school or heard it before. But the poem begins, actually I won't start from the beginning, but in the second stanza of the poem, he's having a nostalgic moment, and his syntax is really wonderful, and I'll say it for you. He says, "Oh, for a draught of vintage that hath been kept cool in the deep delved earth, tasting of flora and country green, dance, provincial song, and sunburnt mirth." And so in this, he goes on to, in the same kind of syntactical gesture, to reflect the nostalgia. His sentence structure is breathy, kind of full of commas, to put us in that dreamlike state, that state of wistfulness, of nostalgia. And so in poetry, it's really exciting to use syntactical gestures, because the unit of the sentence isn't always the primary mode. So we have both fewer options and way more options in which to think of what our units are that we manipulate. It could be a stanza, it could be a line, it could be the unit of the sentence, it could be the poem as a whole. We even have things like prose poems, poems that sit in blocks of text that look like prose, but are disguising themselves in that way and actually operating as a poem, if you think genre is useful in that way. I have other thoughts on genre, but we won't get into it. And then, in your standard essays for school, syntax is important too, mostly because even if you're not entering a character or the essence of some sort of emotional state, or describing a scene with a sort of resonance underneath it, syntactical variation, varying your sentence structure, will inevitably keep a reader engaged. Having different types of sentences, in a way, it's like you need to know your grammar, kind of, but like even for me, like my mom was an English teacher, and she taught me grammar very deeply, but now, like 20 years later, I've totally forgotten it, but I have it sort of underneath in a kind of intuitive sense. And so use intuitive grammar. You don't have to think about it like, oh, where do I put this direct object or whatever. Just think about like, write a sentence the way you would, and then if you notice that all of the following sentences follow that same kind of structure, even if it's just an undercurrent of structure, think about ways in which sentences can look different. I would say a good exercise for this week would be to write a sentence, a single sentence, a long sentence, maybe, I don't know, a 15-word sentence. And it can have any kind of grammatical underpinning that you want it to, but inevitably with a sentence at that length, you'll be able to write that same sentence with units in different places, and just see how many ways you can, even if certain things have to change, like punctuation or a word here or there. Think about the ways in which sentences can transform on a choreographed level rather than a meaning level. Yeah, I love syntax. It's my favorite thing. It feels like you're moving puzzle pieces around in order to work through emotional gestures or intuition and sound. And those two things, the sort of mechanical and the more interior elements of writing, blend together, and it's wonderful. It's really exciting, and you, the writer, are the arbiter of that relationship, and so it's super cool. Yeah, I guess that's it for this week. Please email me again. I'm once again glued to my computer, and we'll get back to you if you emailed me last week. If you email me this week, I'm here. Yeah, and have a great week. Bye.